Hi guys, Garage RC here, back on another video. So today's video is about top tips in relation to how to set up your drift car. Now some of these tips I'm going to share with you apply to all drift cars, but at this particular point in time, as I've got a lot of XRXs in front of me here, I can actually demonstrate on the same car how different steering geometry will affect the car. So the first tip I'm going to go into is making sure that your steering system and your suspension system is loose. What do I mean by that? That there is no friction in the system for the servo to overcome. We like to think these servos are quite strong, and unless you've got a very powerful servo, and even then you don't want it sticking in your steering system. This goes for all-wheel drive cars as well. I had the same issue with my GLA and my SZ. Until I loosened off the steering system, the servo wouldn't center properly, or the car would overturn, as in it wouldn't correct its line quick enough. Once I got that correct and then used a larger servo, I had much better control over the car. And the same applies to these drift cars. So what do I mean by this? You might think your steering system is free. So here's a car I'm building at the moment. Okay, I haven't finished it yet, and I've purposely disengaged one of the steering links here to show you what I mean. And when I let go of the steering link, it drops. That's how loose it should be. It should just drop. It should be loose. Now, if you look at the wheel here, I'm turning it. Oh, it feels loose. Oh, that must be loose enough. No, it's not. That's too stiff. Let me show you what I mean. So here's another car that I built. This is the Porsche I did in the last video, the driving video. Now, if I leave it long enough, you'll watch the wheel just drops back down again. Now, that is actually how loose you want it. You want it so your wheel doesn't stay put when there's nothing attached to it. That means it's super free. Okay, compare that to this one here. You can see it's just a bit stiffer. Even that is too stiff. Okay, here's another one I've built. You can see it's dropping back down. That's how loose you want it. Okay, the reason why I use both these cars is this one's got plastic knuckles, this one's got alloy knuckles. It makes no difference. The ball joint is plastic into a metal ball head, so you should be able to get that kind of movement. Unless your steering is that free, you're going to find that your steering locks up or doesn't work properly, or the car doesn't steer as well as it should. This also applies to the steering arms here. You can see how loose that is. Mine, that won't even stay up, it's so loose. And that also applies to your suspension system. Now, this car that I've just built, the suspension system is actually fine. But on some of these, I had to do the same on these to loosen them up. Now, how did I loosen them up? There are lots of different techniques. The one I'm going to use is a tricky one. Now, I'm going to recommend you be very careful, know what you're doing when you do this. Because if you're like me and a bit heavy-handed sometimes, you can break the ball end. But this is a tip I saw actually from when I was building my DLZ version 2. And it involves gripping the end of the plastic ball joint while it's actually in the connected to the metal ball head, and giving it a squeeze, and that will loosen off the joint. Now if you do it too hard and slip off, you're going to break it, so you got to be careful. Another way to do it, I've shown in previous videos. I have a Dremel which has a ball end approximately this size. It's not that abrasive, and I use that just to smooth out the joint in the plastic. I find that's quite aggressive as well if you're not careful, so you have to make sure that you're super gentle and keep trying it on. These are tips that are going to make it easier for your car to steer, and you want your steering to be free. Now, you might be the case that when you click it all together, it is free, wonderful, but it's common in all cars, whether it's the XRX, the GLD, the DLZ version 2, and I want to give credit to Atomic here because it's on their YouTube video that showed me this tip, which I wasn't aware of before, for the joints, and that works pretty well. Just be careful and don't use pliers with grips on them, otherwise you're going to break the ball joint. This is actually smooth, as you can see, and I'm only applying gentle pressure, and that works pretty well. But you've got to have a steering system that's free. If it's not, the car isn't going to correct, especially with a gyro trying to help you. It's not going to be able to correct itself quick enough or center itself quick enough. Easy way to test that is turn your car without the gyro on, turn it to the right, let go, or to the left, let go. See if the wheels go all the way back to center if they're slightly off. If they're slightly off, then you know there's a bit of catching somewhere in the steering mechanism, and it could be any of those places. Another tip worth mentioning quickly before we move on to further settings is that the ball end, when it's on the ball joint, is parallel to the direction of motion. You don't want it twisted this way, so when the steering moves it's almost coming off. You want it kind of square on, as you can see with mine there. Okay, so moving on to settings in general. We've discussed this before. I've even given the measurements of the settings I have, but sometimes this isn't enough. Now here you can see my wheels pretty much are parallel in both directions. Well, I may have lost a bit there when I took the steering link and back off on again. I'll have to reset that. I've talked about ride height before and how important the ride height is with making sure that your car handles correctly so that your wheels are all touching equally when you're steering left to right. But let's just say, for example, you think you've done that, and when you're driving you're finding that as you drift to the right hand side, say, you know, everything is smooth and it's working, and when you go in the other direction, so you're drifting this way, it's fine, you're drifting that way and the car spins. Okay, well, the first thing you need to look at is something is causing that car to spin around a pivot point. Usually it's the wheel, the front wheel on the inside. So have a look at that front wheel on the inside, whichever way it's spinning, and see, is it moving freely? Is it free? Does it keep spinning, or does it jam? Is it wobbly? Is it on tight enough? If it's too loose, that will cause it to bind. Look at the car while you're driving it. If when you turn it in a particular direction you notice one of the front wheels isn't turning, then that's not good. You want to make sure that wheel is free and able to contact and turn. If it's not turning because it's not touching, that's a different problem. That means it might be too high and you need to lower. You have to increase the decrease the distance to the ground on that side, i.e. increase the ride height so the wheel touches down instead of not touching at all. If it is touching and it's not moving, have a look at the wheel. Like I said, is it loose? Is it too tight? Is it wobbling? Okay, so adjust the ride height accordingly until you get those wheels turning in each direction. Check the rear wheel, see if that's touching correctly, see if that's loose, see if that's not engaged properly. Have a look from the back, lift the car up, sit it on a flatter surface and see how the wheels are sitting. Turn the wheels and then see how it's sitting as well. See if it's sitting correctly. Any of these things, if they're not correct, the car will spin in a certain direction. So usually if the suspension as well on that side, so if you've got, say, suspension which is either too soft or too hard, again you have to play around with it and see what improves things. So don't try 3 things at once. If your car's not drifting this way and it's spinning out, and you think the ride height is okay, have a look at the suspension. Make it super hard on that side, see if it still spins out or if it gets worse. If it does, loosen it the other way, make it super soft, see if that makes things better. That's how you're going to find why your car isn't handling correctly. Same with the rear wheels. It's usually the steering wheels that cause more of a problem. Once the rear wheels are set up, you don't usually have this issue. Okay, again, have a look at the weighting of the car. Now this is something I'm going to move on to because I've covered the other points before. I've covered the ride height, I've covered the suspension, I've covered the length of the arms, how I like to have the wheels set up. If you've got one side cambered in a bit more than the other, then you're going to get issues when you steer one way or the other. I had that with my Porsche. I had to go back and check the camber angle because one wheel was slightly different to the other, and that sorted the problem when it was spinning out in one direction. Happens to me too, guys. I have to spend time tuning these cars. They don't just drift straight away. All of these rear-wheel drive mini RC drift cars require a lot of TLC to get them to work properly. That said, though, I found personally the XRX easiest to drift out of the box, and that's because it's got a quite wide setup and I think the balance is pretty good. So again, we've tested all these things. What are the other things we can check? Well, for example, I think I did mention in a previous video that I have my car set up with the caster set back with a washer in front here. So even as out the box, you can adjust the caster on this car by putting different washers either side of this bar. So I have found that for 94mm and 98mm, the caster setup with the washer here and the arms pulled back, set back, works better. If on this same car with exactly everything else exactly the same, if I was to remove these washers and move these arms forward, it completely messes up the handling. When I go to drift, the car almost carries straight on. The wheels don't engage. They don't control the drift at all. So it's a very important setting that you may have overlooked. In my 90mm car, I find the other way around works better. See, on this car here, I've got the spacers behind with the caster set forwards, and that works better on my 90mm car. So that's another important tip to consider. Where is your caster setting? What is your wheelbase? If it's not working in one setting, try a different one. You don't have to use washers this thick. You can use thinner washers either side to decide the positioning. Very important tip. Next tip. So I've just mentioned wheelbases. Now, at the 90mm setup, this car is very stable and very good. Now, you wouldn't expect so, but I found this with all of the rear-wheel drive setup cars, that when you extend the wheelbase, you're moving the motor further back. That's going to make it more tail heavy. Now, the mistake I made the other day when I was using my Mercedes shell, to use this shell, you have to set the speed controller, the gyro, a bit further back. So because it's got a long bonnet for it to fit on, if you can see through there. By doing that, I'm moving all the weight to the rear. So now I've already got the motor set back. I've moved the control systems back, and suddenly all my weight is towards the back of the car, and it makes it a little bit harder to control. It makes it harder to hold a drift. So how can I overcome that? Well, if you've got a shell on where you can't move the radio gear forward because of the bonnet length, you can use a counterweight. So here I'm using a 20p piece, weighs about 5 or 6 grams. Just by placing that here, or even a little bit further forward there, or even under the shell at the front towards the nose, that instantly improved the handling. So remember a few videos back I had a Corvette ZR1 shell on here. That's got a slightly higher bonnet, so my radio gear was set further forward. Had no issues at all. I used the Mercedes setup. I managed to drift it, but I wondered why it wasn't as good as the Corvette. So again, the body shell does make a difference. The wheelbase does make a difference. If you need to, use a counterweight. This is a 20p piece, about 5 grams. That's all I needed positioned here. I did try 10 grams. It was unnecessary. It did help, but it made the car feel a bit sluggish. Maybe even 4 grams would be better, but definitely a counterweight, it helped. So be aware of where your radio gear is. So again, this is something you have to consider when you're setting up your car. If you're using a bigger receiver, like I use the micro receivers here, if you've got a big receiver that's bulky and heavy, it's going to take up more space, and it's also going to take up, it's going to affect the weight balance basically, and the shell as well. So if you're using a 94mm Subaru shell, which I do like, it's a neutral weighing shell, most of the weight's over the middle, makes the car much easier to handle. If you're using a tail heavy Mercedes shell like this, of course it's going to make it harder to balance the car out with the motor moved further back. So you've got to consider the options. And typically the kind of feeling you get when the weight's too far to the back is the car will spin out, but also the steering feels less effective. You'll just feel like there's no grip on the steering almost, that the car doesn't grip. And it's partly because if the weight's the back, it's almost tipping the front of the car up. So then you've got to check your ride height again and see, is your ride height at the front too high up, and it's encouraging this backward weight to almost lift the wheels off the ground. That's an exaggeration, but it just gives you an idea of what I mean. If your car's lifting the front off the ground almost, we're imagining that, then you can't steer and drift properly. So in that instance, it might be an idea to raise the rear ride height, lower the front ride height. Again, don't do it all at once. Try just raising the rear first, see if it improves things. Try adding the weight one thing at a time. This process is not instant. It takes a bit of playing around. I'm pretty slow with these things. It takes me a few hours to get this right, sometimes a few days. But it's only by looking at each of these things individually that you actually get somewhere. So that's my next tip. So again, I'll just talk about geometry in terms of your camber and your toe. Make sure it's equal. If your car's spinning one way more than the other, check that you've got those measurements set the same. Another tip here to mention is sometimes you'll find the car might measure exactly the same, but it's spinning one way more than the other. And it might be that you do need to decrease the angle on one side, even though it looks like it's equal. How can that be? How can it be that things aren't precise and whatever you measure here works exactly the same? Well, nothing that's going to be hand built ultimately is going to be 100% symmetrical. You're going to always get slight differences, even on how you've screwed the ball ends into the actual shafts. If you're off by a degree, that wheel's going to be off by a degree. So just allow for these things, and don't be fixated on making sure that everything's perfectly angled level if you're not getting the results actually when you're driving. So start off there, that's your starting point, but then see how the car maneuvers. Like I said, If you see one wheel acting differently, look at why. If you see the car moving in a weird way in one direction compared to the other, look at why and try and counter that. Adjust anything you think one at a time. So if that means you have to adjust the camber, have to adjust the toe, little things, just do one thing, try it, see what difference it makes. It's a bit frustrating if you keep adjusting everything, you'll never know why the car isn't centering or drifting the way you want. Ultimately, if you've got it working correctly, it should drift sideways gently in a crawl at low speed. To do that, you need pretty slippy tyres. I use the LF5s, I use the LF3, but it doesn't make any difference which tyres I use if my geometry isn't set up correctly. I use the LF3s, they're a bit grippier, but that's only when I'm doing tabletop stuff where I want the car to stop instantly. LF5s, the car should handle and set up right off the bat. So another tip, and this applies to all cars again, is making sure your drivetrain is smooth. Now, one of the things I have found is that if I over tighten things, I can lock things up. I say this all the time. Things are over tight, things get locked up. If I was to take a screwdriver now and over tighten this screw on the inside for the shaft that holds this together, if I really put some force into it and tighten it up, it'll make my gearbox clunk a bit. It'll cause it to clunk. It won't be as smooth. Same if I over tighten these wheels, it will affect how smooth everything turns. It makes everything clunky. Even if you take this gearbox apart, make sure you put it back together, check it's smooth, you know. If not, try the diff the other way around. Again, when you're screwing the gearbox together, don't over tighten it. Tighten it enough so it holds it together and check it's smooth. If you over tighten it, it's only plastic, it's going to put pressure on the parts and that's going to affect how smoothly it runs. These are all things that make a difference to how smoothly the car handles. Ultimately though, the rear gearbox isn't going to be what's going to make or break how this car handles. Yes, that'll make it easier with the throttle if it's smooth, but the main player here is the front steering rack system, how smoothly you can get those wheels to turn. If the wheels are jamming, no matter how strong the servo is, it won't center the steering properly, or it won't react correctly to the gyro, and it won't give the correct inputs to help drift the car. So I'll keep going back to that, but that is very important. Tip. Look at how, well, you've seen my driving lesson videos already, but part of that is throttle control. If you're too aggressive with the throttle, the car's not going to drift. So if you need to turn down your EXP or endpoint, do that. Make the car less aggressive. Drift more slowly. Again, that's why I like the LF5 tyres. You can go very slow and the car will still slide. If you can drift slowly and get the hang of it, then the faster drifting becomes more easy. So, look at your throttle control. But again, I'd say that's secondary if you've got everything else right. With these 3,500 kV motors that come as standard, it's harder to over throttle. I mean, if you're using a 7,500 kV motor like I do in my XRX, then it's more likely you're going to have that problem. But if you're used to it, it's going to be fine. So yeah, just be mindful of that. You can reduce the endpoints or turn up the EXP so the motor is less responsive and you can be a bit more gentle with the throttle. Okay guys, I think that's all the tips for today. If you like what I do in the video, drop me a like. If you like what I do on the channel, please subscribe to the channel. And I'll see you guys all in the next video.